Welcome to the AIOps Evolution Weekly broadcast. This series features discourse on topics pertinent to the C-level conversation revolving the integration of artificial intelligence into the ever-evolving IT operations landscape. Discover trends and actionable tips for digital transformation, as well as the latest news on how AIOps is transforming business and government operations to create flow in their organization. And don't stay in the dark on the latest industry news. Join the AIOps Evolution community to stay connected and subscribe to the show at AIOpsevolution.com. Now, let's join our hosts, Sean McDermott and Bill Driscoll, IT thought leaders, visionaries, and the voices on the other end of the mic for the latest episode of AIOps Evolution Weekly.
Welcome, everybody, to this week's AIOps Weekly broadcast. Bill, I'm your host, Sean McDermott, and my co-host, Bill. Bill, how you doing this week?
Doing great. Thanks for asking, John. How are yourself?
Are you going back to New York again this weekend? Seems like every time I talk to you, you're going to New York.
This weekend we're not. So my daughter's been up there. So next weekend my wife's going to get her. So we'll bring her home finally. But this is a weekend at home. So
excellent.
Kicking off August. I can't believe it's August on Sunday.
Yeah, it is.
Summer's flying by.
It's amazing how fast the summer has flown by. So you want to talk a little bit of AIOps before we go into the weekend?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Cool. All right. So we got as usual, we got a couple of stories to bring up, and then we got kind of a main topic. So I'm going to lead off this with an article that came out from CIO Magazine by a guy named Peter Wehner around the top 10 AIOps platforms. So this one, I say this every week. This is interesting, but this is kind of this. I'll start off with the criticism, and then we can jump into some of my thoughts. But the very first sentence of this says, "Artificial intelligence, once a magical concept, the stuff of science fiction, now decades of research and commercialization is making another tool for the enterprise stack to be running." I think AIOps is not yet mainstream. It kind of makes it sound like AIOps is obvious for everybody. I know he's talking about artificial intelligence, but I just kind of found that as the first sentence, like, AIOps is still pretty new. I mean, most of our customers aren't even implemented; they're just kind of thinking about it. And then he kind of jumps into some things, there was a couple of things that he talked about. Use cases. First use case that he talked about was cloud deployment. Second one was around processing alerts, and we've talked about processing alerts. And the other one's around root cause analysis. And a lot of stuff that we hear about AIOps is around root cause analysis. So what are your thoughts on this article?
Yeah, I think that, obviously there's, we talked last week, I remember about, we didn't name any of them, but there's a lot of newcomers. I think the market's growing 2.5 times they expect in the next 5 years. And so there is a lot of room for newcomers and products we're just learning about. And I think in the next article, we're going to talk about a professor who's from Europe that has a product, and we've heard of others. And so there is room for new technology, new products, new innovation, and some of it's just features that are going to be rolled into legacy products or products that are already there. As I look through this list, I mean, every one of these has been around at least 5 years. Some of them have been around 20 years, right? Like the Dynatraces or the IBM and Watson. So these are really the big vendors that are sort of establishing their place in the market. And as we went through them, I think we've worked with almost all of them, at least 8 or 9 out of the 10, and have good experience with them. I mean, none of them are going to be ones that you're going to have, a failed implementation, but I think it's all about setting expectations. And so it was interesting as we'll let the reader sort of read the article and look at the strengths and weaknesses and where they fit. But there were a few things that you sort of look at that differentiates them. So I'll just offer this up to the listener. Data, some of them collect certain types of data better than others. There's definitely some that stand out from providing context and topology and discovery, and it aren't just doing like text, algorithms. Some of them do algorithms, anomaly detection, thresholding, and some are doing other types of algorithms. There's some that stand out that do a lot of feedback and kind of learning. So they do sort of supervised learning, whereas others are more they're going to learn themselves, but they don't sort of allow for that feedback. So, there's a few other things to look at, but cloud, some of them are on premise, right? Whereas others, you really just have one option, which is running in the cloud. So there's definitely 8 to 10 kind of major categories that I highlighted, 5 or 6 of them here, that I think you can look at that see how these fit for your environment. But it's hard. We wouldn't say on any of them it's bad. It's a bad choice. It just depends on how it fits what your needs are and where you're trying to go. So that's my thoughts. But I think it's a pretty good list. I mean, probably pretty close or almost the same the type of list that we would put together if we were asked to do this.
Yeah, I don't know really where he got this list from. There's really no reference in here of how he compiled that list, but you're right. I mean, just to go through like @Dynamics, Big Panda, Datadog, Dynatrace, GitHub Copilot, IBM Watson, Logic Monitor, and Moogsoft, and New Relic and Splunk. Right, so big names in the space, definitely, and I think that it's pretty accurate in that most of these players are introducing AI engines into their products. And uh, I think one of the things that there's a number of these lists starting to go around. Forrester just put out a list of I think under their wave methodology for evaluations. So, and I think having checked out that already, I would say I think there's like 10 or 12 on their list too, and they're about the same. The one that kind of jumped out at me here was GitHub Copilot. I thought that was kind of interesting. I don't know if I would consider that an AIOps platform, because it seems to me to be more of a predictive coding language capability, and there's probably a fair amount of people out there that are skeptical or unsure whether you should be doing predictive code writing, and he talks about that in here. But the other ones, we'll definitely see them around and hear a lot more from these guys going forward. Before we move on, just a shameless plug, right, is that we are getting ready to come out with AIOps Evolution podcast season 2. And through the demand of people listening to season 1, there was a lot of requests for product reviews and product understanding. So that's what season 2 is going to be. So tune in to season 2 of the AIOps Evolution podcast. I think it's slated to come out. We're in October timeframe, so beginning of Q1, and we'll actually be having pretty much all these vendors on and representatives from the companies to talk about their products and what they're doing. So pretty excited about that, and we're actually in production on that right now. So moving on. So next thing we were talking about, you and I were talking about, is a professor out of the Netherlands did a speech. Yeah, did a speech and was interviewed, and I'd love to kind of, you were pretty interested in this one.
Yeah, I think this is I mentioned last week. There's a lot of the PhD programs, and even Moogsoft was one of the one listed. I mean, a lot of their research was out of a university or two in England, and we're seeing a number of universities, PhD candidates in AI, that are shifting their attention to AIOps with the growth. And this was one professor, Odej Kal, that's in University of Technology Berlin. And so I won't mention his product name, but he's involved in a product launch that does really log analytics. So he really provided and gave the speech about what is AIOps, and it's some of the same stuff we talked about, but he boiled it down to a few things. One of the we talked about basically breaking down AIOps into 3 steps: anomaly detection, what looks different; root cause analysis, which is, all right, now we've identified what are anomalies. You're going to see a whole bunch of anomalies. What's the root cause? And then decision-making remediation. So we actually did work with one customer who gave us a pretty simple point of view around AIOps that aligned very much like that. And just, if you want to keep it sort of where your investments are going, I think those are 3 pretty decent, big categories. And so, the other prediction he made in his speech was that he thinks right now AIOps is still sort of growing, but that most companies in 2 to 3 years are going to have AIOps in their platform. So they're going to be either upgrading to platforms that bring AIOps, or they're going to be investing in others. and they're going to need to do that simply to kind of keep pace. So thought that was interesting. And then I think he just sort of gave sort of a one-on-one, a 101 sort of introduction to machine learning, and basically said most of these tools are providing rules where you manually go in and say, if this, then this, or group these things by these very specific things. Supervised learning, and then unsupervised learning. So he kind of brought an academic point of view, to this to this space, and he's sort of touting a little bit of the product and what they're doing around logs. So I don't know, Sean, if you have any thoughts about sort of where products like this are going, or any of the thoughts he had in the article.
Sure. There's a couple of things that I thought, points that came out. One was starting with the data, and we'll talk about that in a little bit because there's a whole conversation we're going to have in a few minutes on that. But I think he's right in the fact that you've got to start where the use case for AI ops right now really is around processing data, and where does that come from? Where in the IT world, and monitoring and log management, things like that, are creating tremendous amounts of data, terabytes, petabytes of data per day. I mean, we have a number of customers that generate multiple terabytes of data a day, which was unheard of like 10 or 15 years ago. So, and most of them, most customers now are collecting, and most, I think, people are collecting lots and lots of data, right? And so he talked about start with the data, and that most companies are in a pretty good position to do that because of their investments in Splunk or Sumo or Elk, Elasticsearch, and that whole Elk stack. So that's, I agree with that on there. He talked a little bit. I agree with the prediction. 2 to 3 years, I think, is going to, most companies are going to be having AI ops as part of their infrastructure. It's just a matter of whether they're going to be bringing in AI ops intentionally, or it's going to be coming as part of upgrades to existing platforms. So like if you're a new Relic user and you upgrade and bring in their AI engine, you're technically using AI ops, but as we've talked about before, AI ops is a strategy. It's not necessarily a tool. So we want, so I agree with that. It's just a matter of our company is going to be positioned to take advantage of AI. And the last thing I think we talked about, or you brought up, which I thought was a very interesting point, and again, that's what kind of 101 around machine learning, was rules versus supervised learning versus unsupervised learning. And I think, having been doing operations for 20 some years, right, and being, one of the first Micromuse guys back in 1997, we did a lot of rules development, hard-coded rules into the rules files. They literally would call rules files. And that's been pretty much a pervasive way of doing things for the last 20 years. And as we move into AI, we need to start thinking about machine learning and machine learning models. And, the supervised is really about, kind of injecting known things into the engine with getting it to learn. And you kind of know what you're predicting what it's going to learn because you're kind of teaching it something, whereas unsupervised, where we're going, allows you to bring in all kinds of structured data and let the system learn on its own. So
What?
Go ahead.
One thing I'd comment on that along those lines before we move to the last topic was, it's interesting. You talk about remediation, and that's his third step, decision making remediation. A lot of I haven't seen a use case really where there is a unsupervised or learning that's truly taking place, and then that's driving some sort of automation. And so it's interesting to see how much of these become, the learning happens, but then if you want to get to the step of remediation and fixing something, do you sort of turn that into sort of a rule, right? Or something that has to that you're now bringing some human intelligence to kind of guide that and say, okay, that's good learning. Now let's make that a rule to drive some sort of remediation or automation. Because right now, I think we see a lot of unsupervised and supervised learning is it's providing suggestions or direction to the human, right? But if you take it to the next step, do you need to hard code that to some extent, right? Or create some sort of rule?
Yeah, I agree. I think that we're doing mostly supervised learning now, right? Because on our deployments around AIOps, we're doing a lot of model manipulation and things like that, and building new models and stuff like that. So it'll be interesting.
Yeah.
And I think this is going to lead on to our next topic. You're going to need skill sets, right, to do all this, and that's where I think some of this gets lost a little bit in that talking about this theoretical what can be done, it just doesn't naturally happen. Companies have to kind of go into the mindset. So let's move on to our last topic and spend a little bit of time here. So this was an interesting article that was written called "The 6 Misconceptions About AI Ops Explained." And by the way, if you're watching this on the left-hand side of the screen, you should see all these articles, and you can click on them and see what we're seeing. So my first comment on this, which really caught my eye right off the bat, was, what is augmented IT operations, parentheses AI ops? And it just kind of made me laugh, because there really is not even a definition yet of what AI means. Like, what's the A? Is it algorithmic? Is it artificial? Is it augmented? That still hasn't been decided. I think Gartner came out with algorithmic when they first coined the term, but now I think most people just assume that it's AI, and sometimes we think about it as augmented. So
Right.
I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but that's
I
small
think
small
it's a
thing of the
combination of both, right? Exactly.
Yeah. So it's whatever you feel like calling it for the day, and maybe you start with algorithmic, then you start with augmented, and then you end up with AI some years from now. But so there's 5 things in this article I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on. Really, 5 the truths about AI ops. What do you find? So the first one is AI ops is not a product. 100% agree with that. He actually calls it a feature or a capability. I'm going to deviate from that because that's not necessarily how we see it. Second one is you need AI. Before you do AI, you need ops. And you and I have had a lot of conversations about that. Third one is AI ops is a cultural shift. We could have a whole broadcast just talking about that. Integration is king and queen. Totally agree with that. And the last one is use the open source Luke. So really emphasizing open source. I think that's debatable. So let's go back to your thoughts on this.
You have it. Yeah, I don't know if he has it in front. If you have it in front of you, because it's 6 misconceptions actually. So the last one.
Oh, I did. I missed one.
Yeah,
data.
Yeah. So and just how
yeah.
important.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I did miss it. I said 6, and I only said 5. So your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I do. The what the A stands for aside, maybe just I'll comment on the first couple things of what he said. AI ops not a product. It's interesting. He said it's a feature or capability, but then he really talked about the magic is in the interconnection. When you interconnect all your tools. And so, a single neuron doesn't make a brain, he says. And so he gets more into that as far as what kind of integrations a little bit later on. But he did list out, 5 separate features that would be critical to AI ops. Baselining metrics, doing root cause analysis, anomaly detection, some sort of correlation, and then also what if scenarios and simulations, which they're in some of the tools we talked about in the beginning, but they're not in all the tools. Not all those tools provide that simulation step. And so what we see is some tools are better at some of those things. Some are better at others, but pulling it all together for across all of the different domains that sort of interrelate to provide an IT service is really what he talks about, the magic happening. And so it isn't about a standalone tool that's really going to provide all of this, especially across your entire IT infrastructure. And then that sort of leads to the second part, which you need ops. And so we've talked about that a lot, that before you add the AI, you need the data. And he talks about data at the end. Is you really need to look at your data. You got to make sure you're not just throwing all the junk and all the noise, everything at your AI, or else you're just going to overwhelm it and do work that's not needed. You really want to do what he calls an exploratory data analysis on your data and look at what is the data that we really need to pull in that's telling us something about the infrastructure, which may have an impact on performance or availability. And so I think that's smart, and we've seen that many times when we worked with sort of manager of managers, that you do want to throttle and you do want to kind of be smart about what you're pulling into the system, into your AI, maybe your centralized manager of manager AI. So he talked next about cultural shift, and I know Sean, you've thought a lot about that as far as the organization and sort of the difference, you know, sort of from a leadership standpoint and vision and the value of this, and that how important the organization is to that.
Yeah,
Do you
I
have any
think
thoughts?
that. Yeah, I think that with the cultural shift, right? Because yeah, I spent a lot of time on this because I think people don't understand exactly how much of an impact culturally, organizational, behaviorally things are going to change when you start introducing
Mhm.
AI ops into your strategy. The other aspect of this, there's two parts that he talked about too that I found even that I kind of focused on a little bit more was the use of open source, right? And certainly there's a lot of organizations out there that are using open source for especially in their monitoring, like I mentioned earlier, like the elk stack. And
Mhm.
but I think that the way he explained, one of the benefits of using open source is to be able to go into the coding and see how things are performing at multiple levels. And I get that, but again, I
Mhm.
keep coming back to this idea that takes skill sets, right? It takes, and I just don't know how many organizations are going to have access to that level of skill sets to use open source technology, because you can do a lot with the open source and you can tweak it and you can customize it, you
Mhm.
can write your own. But again, it takes people, it takes smart people to be able to do that. And so I think there's going to be a lot of organizations out there that are going to be really relying on the market to do that, right?
Mhm.
And bring the market to bring solutions and prepackaged capabilities that they're willing to pay for, because it's easier for them to pay a third party company to do that versus trying to hire a team of data scientists. And he brought in the idea of data sciences into this cultural shift, right? So they're kind of intertwined, because the cultural shift is going to require you to bring on new people into your IT organization that you don't necessarily have today, i.e., data scientists. But the more technology you have delivered by third-party vendors, like the ones we talked about, the 10 we just talked about, may allow you to not rely on as many data scientists coming into your organization. So everything has a balance here, right? And again, I thought this article was excellent, right? And it just highlights that everything has to kind of you know operate in balance of all these technologies and tools and skill sets and organizational change and vision. That this is why we keep saying AI ops is a strategy. It's not a product, right? It's not a use case. It's really a broader vision of how you want to run your organization with the introduction of AI into it, and all the changes that are going to happen. And these are pretty good highlights of some of those changes. So, Bill, I think that kind of wraps up our time here today. Thanks a lot for joining us. This, like you're like some special guest. You're on here every week. But thanks for joining. I hope you have a great weekend. And one, I want to thank our sponsor, Windward Consulting Group, global leader in AI ops. You can check them out at www.windward.com, windward.com, or you can Google AIOps investment plan, and they should come out at the top of that. And so, everybody, I hope you have I thank you for joining us on this week's episode, and I look forward to seeing you next week. And have a great weekend. Take care.
Thank you for joining us in this conversation about AI ops and the future of IT operations. Interested in a deeper dive on these topics? Check out our resources available at AIOpsevolution.com. And remember to subscribe to get the latest episode.